All right, class. First off, as always, good day. I'm glad you're here. Today, we're going to be talking about the German Enigma code, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the code talkers for the Americans. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with the warm up. All right, so here it is. The first question asks you what is going on here. The second one says, what do you think this artist is trying to say? Okay. Now, I know typically the warm-up picture really connects with the lesson, but this lesson apparently, that day when I was creating it, um, the files got corrupted, and I had to basically make this lesson in less than half an hour, and so I forgot where I found the warm-up picture, so I had to get something last second, and this was the closest thing I could find. So I do apologize because it doesn't really connect too much with the lesson, but it's something. Okay, so write your responses. Um, Pause the video. Okay, because we're moving on in three, two, one. All right, so the German Enigma code, or machine should say. It's a device used by the German military command to encode strategic messages during World War II. Right, so that is the actual Enigma machine right there. You see that picture. Here's the thing: this machine wasn't created during World War II. In fact, it was created in 1923 by a man named Edward Elgar. Now, it wasn't meant for military use. Quite the opposite. It was made for everyone usages. Basically, what you did with this machine, it kind of looked like a typewriter. Okay, what you would do was you would write a message. Let's say you're writing a little love letter to your boo, right? You'd be like, "I love you, honey." You type the "I love you." This machine would then translate what you're pressing into different letters, and then basically you could just send it out to the world, and unless you had the key, the code, you wouldn't understand what the thing said. So your honey, your little boo, whoever it may be, would have the code, and then they could translate what you wrote to them. Okay. Uh, the thing is, this machine looks simple, right? It just looks like a little box, and that's it. It's actually very sophisticated inside. All right, so here's how it works. Inside the machine, there's three rotors, okay? And there are five sets of those rotors. Excuse me. Each of the rotors had 26 positions, which is 26 letters, okay? And then the plug board had 10 pairs of letters that were connected. So basically, if you did the math, 26 times 26 times 26, and keep doing that, um, you got the total number of possibilities, which was 158 quintillion. Okay, the total number of possibilities is, I'm going to read the number out for you. Okay, 158 quintillion, 962 quadrillion, 555 trillion, 217 billion, 826,360,000 possibilities. So just like I was telling the class, um, we currently have 8 billion people on Earth. Okay, just follow me here for a second. We have 8 billion people on Earth. With that being said, let's see, thousands, million, billion. If everybody got one of those codes, those boxes, every person on Earth, every person would need to have 158 billion different combinations to figure out one code. So again, every person on Earth, all 8 billion, would need to go through 158 billion different codes to figure out just one code. Everyone would have a different code, and only one person in the entire world would eventually get to it if they went through all 158 billion codes. They might get to it. That's the only way. So that's just should show you how astronomically hard it was to break this code. With that being said, there were some Polish mathematicians who learned how to break the code using math. And now this is before the war started, and these guys figured out how to break the code. Okay, and what they did is they actually gave this knowledge to the British. Here's the problem. It only works, the Polish, what they discovered only works if the key, the password, never changes. But the Nazis realized this as like, well, you know what? If we keep the same password, eventually someone's gonna find it. So you know what? Just to make things harder, let's change the code every single day at midnight. And this was a huge shot to the gut to the Allies when World War II started. Okay? They had to go through 158 quintillion different possibilities in less than a day to break the code and see what the Germans were doing. All right, so here's your first question. Do you think we, at this current time, do you think we have machines or programs that can create codes or messages that are impossible to break? Okay. Do you think we have anything like that right now? Now, I had some students in class who tried to say like, oh, well, stuff on your phone, when you do social media and stuff like that, um, the cops can't break the codes. Well, yeah, because cops need warrants, but hackers can go through that stuff easily, you know, no problems. Hackers don't have to worry about warrants, things like that. So, do you think that the government or somebody has created some type of machine or a program that can create codes or messages that are unbreakable? What do you think? Okay, and tell me why you think this. If you say yes, the government has some type of program, program that can create messages that are basically impossible to break. If you think so, explain why. If you say no, that's not possible, there's no way, explain why. Okay, so pause the video, okay, because we're moving on in 3, 2, 1. All right, so here's the thing. The Nazis were so confident that nobody could break their code that they broadcasted their codes on open airlines, meaning anyone could take their radio, turn the dial, and basically hear the code. The Nazis knew there's no way anyone could break this, so they let it out for everyone to hear. The British code breakers, they basically had like 18 hours to break this code. They would get their first message around like 6 in the morning, and then they would start going through 158 quintillion different possibilities, trying to figure out. And let's say they were on the verge, 17 hours, 17 and a half hours in, they would only have like half an hour left before the code changes, and then they had to start anew. Yeah, so it was very, very frustrating for these guys. Now, there was a mathematician named Alan Turing. This guy had an idea to create a device that could do math faster than any human, including himself. And so he starts working on this machine, which what we would now know as a computer. Okay. He named the machine Christopher, but the team in the end would later be called the Bombi. The thing is, at first, the machine's going through the different combinations all 158 quintillion of them, and it can't figure it out because there's too many different possibilities. So it hits them. Well, what if we find a common word or words that are used, and then we'll know that for this letter, it's this letter. For this letter, it's this other letter. And they realize, you know what? Every single message, every single phone call, every single conversation that ends, the Nazi people, all the German people, the generals, everyone has to say the same thing at the end. Heil Hitler. Every message, every phone call, all that stuff, even first face-to-face contact, they had to say Heil Hitler. That's how big Hitler's ego was. So when they got the message, they'd find at the very end, it's the same number, the same letters over and over at the very, very end of every transmission. So they knew this was Heil Hitler. So now they know what the H is, the E, the I, the L, the R, the T's. And from there, they just put the machine for this letter, this letter, this letter, this letter, and the machine solved the problem every single day. So when the Nazis changed at midnight, at 6 a.m., when they got the first message, they knew at the very end, this is what H is for today. Today, H is now E, E is now Q, I is now A, and they would just put on the machine what those letters were, and it'd take about a minute, and then poof, 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 here's the code. This letter's for this letter, this letter's for this letter, and things like that. All right, so question number 2 says, if Turing and his team hadn't created the machine, do you think the Nazis would have won the war? What do you think? Tell me why or why not. Okay, so pause the video, write your response, because we're moving on in 3, 2, 1. Now, here was the biggest problem that Turing and his group faced. Now, it's one thing they cracked the code, which was, again, amazing. But now, what do they do with that information? Because if they intercepted a transmission telling a German U-boat to attack a British ship that doesn't know it's there, right? It's a surprise attack. And all of a sudden, the British ship, all of a sudden, it's going to be going straight for miles, maybe even days. It's going in one direction, and all of a sudden, it stops, or it makes a turn away from the U-boat. That basically tells the Germans, wait, why did they change directions all of a sudden? And that would trigger like, oh, they know the code. How did they know this U-boat was going to be right there at that time? So in order to save the code, the British had to let some people die, especially on secret attack missions. Okay. Now let's say, what would happen then if the Germans knew? Well, basically they would cut off all radio communications. And remember, Germans are great engineers, so they could have easily gotten the machine, tweaked it a little bit, add some more reels, do some other things to it. And now there's an altered box that they can do to other boxes. And the British would not have those alterations. They would have to basically have to steal one of those boxes to figure it out. That, or the Nazis were going to find a totally different way to communicate in which the British wouldn't know what that was until it was already too late. So yeah, they had to keep it a secret. They had to know when to use the information wisely. So what would happen is, let's say the Germans are coming straight down against the British, right? British are coming up this way. Here comes the Nazis. What might happen, they might use the information like telling Americans, hey, you guys are, the British are going this way, here comes Americans. Why don't you guys team up? and be one coalition, one big force coming down the middle. Now, it would look like, hey, the Americans were already coming this way, and they figured, hey, let's join up together since we're both at the same area. That seems logical. That seems reasonable. Yeah, and then that would make the Nazis kind of think about twice about attacking, you know. So that's how they use the information. They used it wisely and where it wouldn't look like they knew, you know. So let's say the Nazis had a secret cache of weapons right here, right? What they might tell the Americans or the British, you know, you guys should go attack this town, this town, this town, and then, oh, look, we're attack this town, and look what we found, you know. So it's like, oh, they went through that area, they checked all the towns, and then they got to the one where the cache was. They just got lucky, you know. So that's how they use the information from the codes. Um, the thing is, after the war, it couldn't be this let out that they knew the code, you know. So it wasn't until the 1970s that it was finally disclosed that, hey, the British knew the Enigma code and they solved it way back when. So people like Turing and his group, they could not tell a soul that they broke the code. Their military records were completely sealed, and some people, if they opened the package, the paper, it would basically be empty. They were top secret, and their records were basically erased. So here's my next question to you. Do you think the Allies did the right thing and let some people die to protect the code? You know, so in other words, do you believe the old saying, it's better to sacrifice a little to save a lot? Do you think that's true? Do you think that's justified? You know, hey, if you sacrifice this small group of people, you're going to end up saving all these large a group of people. Or do you believe like no, whenever you can save a life, you save a life? What do you think? And tell me why did you choose that? Okay, so pause the video, write your response, because we're moving on in three, two, one. All right, so we're going from one unbreakable code to another one, but this one's the Americans. Now remember, the Americans joined the war later, and they knew about the Enigma code. So the Americans are like, we need a code that can't be broken either. And they're racking their brains trying to figure out a code. And this one guy named Philip Johnson, he said, well, why don't we get Navajo Indians? You know, the language spoken by the Native Americans is only spoken in America. And on top of that, there's not many Native Americans left in the country. So the number of people who could actually understand what they're saying is tiny, tiny, tiny. So these guys became known as code talkers. Okay. Um, the two biggest groups were the Navajo and Camachis. Yes, there were other ones, the Lakotas, the Blackhawks, Pawnee, things like that. But the two biggest groups were Navajo and Comanche. Now, what they did is they studied the Navajo language to basically say words that meant other words or letters. So like for tanks, because there is no word for tank in Navajo, they would use another word like turtle. You know, there's no word for airplanes. So they use words like bluebirds or blue jays. Like I said in class, if you know Spanish, there's no Spanish word for the soda Sprite. So Mexicans say Sprite, you know, because that's the closest we can get to saying Sprite, because again, there is no Spanish word for Sprite. So that's what they did. They used a common word that they knew in Navajo to represent a tank, a plane, submarine, things like that. Now, they were used specifically in the Pacific. I know it says it here, not in Europe. They did fight a little bit here and there in Europe, but nowhere near as many times as they did in the Pacific. In the Pacific, they basically fought in every single battle. Now, the thing is, which makes it interesting, is that the Japanese soldiers who heard the message on the radio, they would hear like shuck tuck, load, this and this and that. They would basically be going like, "What are they saying? What are these Americans saying?" And they're like, "It's code, but how do you spell this?" And even if they did spell it right, okay, so what does this C, is C a J, is this E, this, and so they had code breakers of their own, and they're trying to break it down. They even had the Germans try to help out. And again, the Japanese are very smart people. So are the Germans, and they couldn't figure it out. They looked at it as one letter equals another letter instead of it's a whole different language. They couldn't wrap their minds around that. And the Navajo code was never broken. It was declassified in 1968, but it was not broken. So that's the end of this lesson. Hopefully you learned something new. Hopefully you enjoyed this lesson. Um, you will learn more about the Navajo code talkers next year in U.S. history. Okay. This is just to give you a little prior knowledge and things like that. Okay. So, you guys, you take care, you be safe, and I'll see you guys later. Okay.